Hey class, I hope everybody's having a good day. We're still talking about the Renaissance, and we're talking about the Northern Renaissance today. It's a little different from the Italian Renaissance. It began when the Italian Renaissance spread through Europe, and it was called the Northern Renaissance, and it went to all different countries. It went to Germany, it went to England, it went to France. France was first because France had invaded uh, Italy in the 1400s, and when they did, they brought back some of their culture with them, and so, uh, but it was called the Northern Renaissance, But it spread throughout Europe, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Dutch. We're going to talk about Martin Luther a little bit today. Not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. He started the Protestant Reformation, and we're going to talk about William Shakespeare, who was a very important part of the Renaissance in England, or the English Renaissance, and a great playwright. All right, he was probably, in my opinion, he's the greatest playwright to ever live. He did all kinds of stuff: Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. He's done all kinds of plays. He did then, and considered one of the greatest ever. So that's what we're talking about today: the Northern Renaissance and how it spread through Europe and to the different countries. So if you look here, this is a picture for the Northern Renaissance. And the Northern Renaissance refers to Renaissance art, architecture, and philosophy that took place outside of Italy. It was called the Northern Renaissance.
What was the Northern Renaissance? The center of the European Renaissance movement was in Italy. Over time, however, the ideas and influence of the Italian Renaissance spread to other areas of Europe. The Northern Renaissance refers to Renaissance art, architecture, and philosophy that took place outside of Italy.
All right, so one of the first places that the Renaissance spread to was France. And the reason being was France invaded Italy. France came down here and invaded Italy in the 1400s, and when they did, they came into contact with Italian paintings and their philosophies. And the king was like, "Hey, I like this." The King of France did, and Francis I. So he invited people like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, other artists to come move to France in order to spread this philosophy, spread this art.
French Renaissance. One of the first places that the Renaissance spread was to France. This was because France invaded Italy in the late 1400s and came into contact with Italian paintings and artistic philosophies. The King of France, Francis I, invited many Italian artists to move to France, including Leonardo da Vinci.
All right. One thing that France is notorious for that they did during this time period with the French Renaissance was, before, you had castles. Okay, you had castles. The Middle Ages had castles everywhere. All right. Well, these castles were replaced by French chateaus. All right. And if you look here, the French chateaus were very pretty. They had gardens filled with statues, fountains. I wouldn't mind living in one of those. I mean, if you look at it, that's huge. So, but that's one of the things they brought: architecture. The French architecture brought to the French Renaissance.
French Renaissance continued. French architecture changed during the time as well. Kings and nobles began to build bright pleasure palaces called chateaus instead of the dark fortress castles of the Middle Ages. Many chateaus had large landscape gardens filled with statues and fountains.
All right, then you had the Dutch Renaissance. All right, during the Dutch Renaissance, this man right here, he was a Catholic priest. Erasmus was his name. He was called the Prince of Humanists. All right, and the reason being is he wrote a lot of important works, including The Praise of Folly and The Foundations of Abundant Style, which I'm not going to get into, but he was called the Prince of Humanists, and his name was Erasmus.
Dutch Renaissance. During the Dutch Renaissance, Dutch painters developed their own style. Dutch painters brought a new approach to detail, realism, and naturalism. The Dutch also had an impact on the philosophy of humanism. Catholic priest Erasmus was called the Prince of Humanists. He wrote many important works, including The Praise of Folly and Copia, Foundations of the Abundant Style.
All right, we've already talked about this. This is the printing press, but this was part of the German Renaissance, which was part of the Northern Renaissance altogether, because it spread to different countries. the printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg, and it was very, very important. Like I said, when we talked about it, it was one of the most important inventions of modern times, and it helped spread ideas because you could make books with it. You could help make books really rapidly, unlike before when it was written by hand.
German Renaissance. Germany had a significant influence on the European Renaissance, starting with the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. The printing press allowed for new ideas of the Renaissance to spread throughout Europe.
Another important figure in the German Renaissance was Martin Luther. I said a while ago we were going to talk a little bit about him, and not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther. He was part of the Catholic Church, but he started this thing called the Protestant Reformation when he published his 95 Theses in 1517. And his ideas and his thesis attacked the Catholic Church, and it caused a lot of people to think, hey, Christianity maybe shouldn't be exactly the way it is here.
German Renaissance continued. Another German that played a major role in the Renaissance was a priest named Martin Luther. He started the Protestant Reformation when he published his 95 Theses in 1517. His ideas attacked the Catholic Church and caused many people to rethink Christianity.
All right. One of the last places to start the Renaissance was England. All right, and it started around the peak of the Elizabethan era, which is this woman right here. She was Queen Elizabeth I, all right? And during this time, England began to have prosperity, peace, and many different things occurred in English. But one of the most important things that occurred in England, or most important things, was theater. And I'll get to that on the next slide. But England was one of the last places in Europe to experience the Renaissance.
English Renaissance. One of the last areas of Europe to experience the Renaissance was England. The peak of the English Renaissance occurred during the Elizabethan era. During this time, England experienced peace and prosperity. Many foreign artists were imported to the Tudor court, and their ideas began to take root in England.
All right. Like I said, the most important aspect of the English Renaissance was theater. This man right here is William Shakespeare. All right. Like I said, he was one of the greatest playwriters in the history of the world. He's still considered one of the greatest playwriters, if not the best. So, but theater came about because he wrote these plays and they performed these plays. It's kind of like going to the movies, only it was live action. All right, there was real people up on stage, and you'd sit in these seats around here and watch a play. It's like going to the movies. So, but William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe wrote some of the most memorable plays in world history, and they established these theaters throughout London. And like I said, that was one of the most important aspects of the English Renaissance was theater.
English Renaissance continued. The most important aspect of the English Renaissance was theater. Popular playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe wrote some of the most memorable plays in world history. Permanent theaters were established throughout London where a variety of plays were staged, including tragedies, comedies, and history plays.
All right, let's get to some of our comprehension questions now. What was art and philosophy that spread through Europe called? What was it called? What did we talk about today? A, the Northern Renaissance, B, the Middle Ages, or C, Black Death? We talked about the Northern Renaissance today. It was called the Northern Renaissance when it branched out from Italy and spread throughout Europe. It was called the Northern Renaissance.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, number 2, where was one of the first places the Renaissance spread? Was it England, Scotland, or France? It was France. France was one of the first places, and the reason being is because France invaded Italy in the 1400s, and the king of France was like, Francis I, he's like, hey, I like some of this art and stuff. Y'all going, hey, why don't you come over here? Y'all come on to France. Come live in France. So it was one of the first places that the Renaissance spread was France.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 3, what Catholic priest was called the Prince of Humanists? Was it A, William Wallace, B, Erasmus, or C, King Edward I? It was B, Erasmus. He was Dutch, and this was during the Dutch Renaissance, and they had a big part in humanism, and he was considered the prince of humanists.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what German started the Protestant Reformation? Was it A, Martin Luther, B, William Wallace, or C, King Edward I? It was A, Martin Luther, not to be confused with Martin Luther King or Martin Luther King Jr. He was a priest, and he did not agree with some of the things in the Catholic Church, and he wrote the 95 Theses. And when he did that, it put ideas in people's heads. Hey, maybe the Catholic Church isn't running things right.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And our last one, number 5. What was the most important part of the English Renaissance? Was it A, art, B, architecture, or C, theater? It was C, theater.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
William Shakespeare came about during this time, and him and Marlowe wrote all these different plays, and they went and they performed these plays. People, actors and actresses did. Actually, it was all actors then, because even the males played female parts at that time. So, but they performed here, in these different theaters, performed these different plays that they had written, and Shakespeare is one of the most important and probably the greatest playwright in history.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, that's all for today. I'm going to post this. I may have something else up for you for Friday. I probably won't have another lesson, but I'll probably post some things in class or on my Google Classroom, so y'all can do, and I'll have some YouTube videos to go along with this, with some songs probably. So anyway, I hope everybody has a good day, and I will see you soon.